Hi, I'm Professor Nicky Marsh and I'm here with my colleagues, Dr. Paul Crosthwaite and Professor Peter Knight, and we're going to talk about the history of financial advice. We've been working on a project for some time that's exploring how the genre developed, who read it and how it was read, and we're just going to go over the way in which it emerged. So, Paul, can you tell us where the idea for this project came from and why we began it?
I guess the starting point for this project was the fact that we were intrigued by a kind of puzzle or inconsistency in a certain aspect of the history of finance. A very popular, prominent, long-standing, widely read form of writing about the stock market is the investment advice guide. A guide to how to invest, how to make money, how to understand and be successful in the stock market. A popular form, and popular despite the fact that there's little clear evidence that by buying these books and even by following the kind of advice that they offer, you're likely, as an ordinary person in the street, to make money consistently, reliably, or to any significant extent as a stock market investor. So in other words, to put it very crudely, why are these guides so popular if, to all intents and purposes, they don't seem, at least consistently or to a significant degree, to work? So that was the kind of the starting puzzle, trying to find out, okay, if they're not necessarily giving people what they seem to be giving them, what might they be giving them instead? And we began to think that there might be something more emotional, something more about a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of confidence, a sense of imagining your ability to operate in the market rather than necessarily the actuality of doing so.
When did the genre begin and how has it developed? Can you take us through some of the kind of key moments in the history that we've been looking at?
Yeah, so I guess the first instance of a book that kind of really fits into this mould, that's identifiable as an antecedent of books still being published today, would be a book that appeared in 1761 by a man called Thomas Mortimer. It was a book called Every Man His Own Broker. And it was based on Mortimer's own experience of the culture of Exchange Alley in the City of London, a world that he saw as a kind of nefarious, sinister, corrupt realm of dishonest, disreputable stock jobbers. And he saw his role as being to try to explain and make transparent and intelligible this world for those who might want to venture into it and try their hand at stock speculation. This was a hugely successful book, went through numerous editions over several decades, and for a long time it was the only real manual of this kind available. Through the 19th century, though, in the UK, gradually a recognisable genre, a whole range of books of this kind began to emerge, initially with a quite factual, statistical-based style, but increasingly becoming more geared towards advice, this is how to go about the process. And I guess the centre of gravity of this kind of writing by the late 19th century, certainly the early 20th century, has shifted towards the United States, the world of Wall Street. And it's in this period that we see the emergence of the two kind of key schools, the key paradigms of investment advice. The technical analysis school, represented, for example, by a book like William Peter Hamilton's The Stock Market Barometer, arguing that we should try to understand the emergence of patterns in the movement of the stock market in order to predict its future movements. And increasingly post-Wall Street crash, post-1929, through the emergence of fundamental analysis, forms of analysis that try to look to the fundamental underlying soundness or otherwise of companies to determine whether they are viable investments. Security analysis, a book by Benjamin Graham and David Dodd, would be the Bible of this mode, and it's a hefty tome, as you can see. By the mid-20th century, the technical analysis field also had its definitive textbook tome in the form of Robert Edwards and John McGee's Technical Analysis of Stock Trends, another very hefty, very considerable book that gave a systematic overview of the technical analysis area of investment. And After the middle of the 20th century, though, these two paradigms remain dominant, I guess, but there's a kind of spread of these forms of advice in all kinds of different directions, a real kind of diversification of the field. One thing, though, that really comes to the centre in the latter half of the 20th century is the question of the role of women in the world of investment, the question of gender, and how to make sense of the figure of the female investor. Nicky, could you say something about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the kind of ironies of the whole genre is that we know from the historical analysis that women have always been very powerful figures in the financial investment. They've been sometimes over 50% of stockholders. And yet we also know from our experience of reading this work is that these books never explicitly address women. And in America, in the period that I'm looking at in the 1970s, as women become more powerful politically through the women's movement, then the absence of women from these books becomes a source of concern, a source of kind of tension in interesting ways. And we can trace what happens to women in different kinds of books. So this book here is Howard Ruff's How to Prosper During the Coming Bad Years. And it's a book that's very typical of financial advice in the 70s, which is seizing the financial apocalypse, seizing high inflation, seizing uncertainty, the oil crisis, and trying to find ways of riding this crisis and monetising this crisis. And Ruff's book articulates in a kind of an extreme way what I think is often just implicit in other works, and that is that the world has changed, the economy is tanking because the world has changed, and one of the things that's changed is that women have become active agents. So he says explicitly, the problem isn't only inflation, the problem isn't only big governments, the problem is that women aren't staying at home. It's women demanding pay for their labour that's changing the economy. So we have on the one hand this kind of quite a libertarian, quite a kind of conservative view that women are the problem. But in other ways, we get women's financial advice being written and popularised as never before. I'm one of the first woman of finance, as she was called in America in the 70s and 80s, is Sylvia Porter. And her money book was published in 1973 and is also described as a Bible. It's funny you should use that. It's also described as a Bible. But what Porter indicates, the ways in which female advice for women, and often by women, was entering the mainstream, is that it wasn't only investment advice, or that it combined financial investment advice with all other kinds of financial decisions. It begins with how should you buy your cradle, and it ends with how should you buy your grave. And in between there's everything else, including, for example, how much blood have you got in your blood bank. So Sylvia Porter says, before having surgery, ask around your friends and family who've got the same blood group, and you can top up your blood group. So I think the ways in which gender is working in these books in this period is quite different. We have a genre that's emerging for women, by women, and what that really reveals is that everything is being bought into the market at this point, as notions of risk become privatised and individualised, and everything is seen as a financial decision. But at the same time, we've also got, and Ruff is an extreme example, we find other examples of it in kind of more mainstream advice like Peter Lynch or Burton Malkiel, that they're worrying away at what women's agency means in the market, and it's not seen to be something that is simply good. One of the things that's interesting about this project is that we've come at it as cultural historians, but also as literary critics. And Peter, could you talk about what that's meant for it?
Yeah, although we have teamed up with economic historians, the three of us are literary scholars, and we have wondered, what are we bringing to the table? And I think there are four things that we can think about. The first would be the idea that I think a lot of these books are really dealing with desire, with fantasy, with the idea that these are stories that they're telling, that it's imagination, and we can encapsulate that idea in the sense that economics is not so much about rational expectations as most economists have argued, but instead it's about fictional expectations. It's about the idea of the projection of a future world that is yet to come. The second thing is we would claim that these writings are performative. They actually bring about the world that they seem to be describing. And in some cases, they are quite literally self-fulfilling prophecies. If you think of a work, for example, Thomas Lawson's book, Frenzied Finance, he was kind of incredibly well-known stock promoter in the first decade of the 20th century, and he made a fortune from promoting stocks like Amalgamated Copper. But at the same time, he was a muckraking journalist and also a novelist. And the way he started to make money was by writing these these apocalyptic fictions claiming that the market was about to crash. And lo and behold, it did, because he had so many readers that believed his every word, even though it was fictional. It brought about the crash in the market that his fiction had anticipated. So the third thing I think that we're looking at is the idea that what we're dealing here with is, in effect, fantasy football. If you think about the fact that in 1900, for example, only 1% of Americans were invested in the market in any shape or form, and yet there was a vast explosion of writings like the Lawson. And so you're left wondering, why were people so emotionally invested in the market long before they were actually invested in the market? And I think, the answer that we're finding is these books are about projection, they're about fantasy, they're about desire. So if you think of a work like this one, this is a guide put out by the brokerage Hayton Freeze. It's called Guide to Investors, and this was produced every year in ever larger numbers, and it was basically written for people going to the bucket shops. These were glorified gambling halls where people were betting on the rise and the fall of the market. And this kind of guidebook was telling you how the market worked, how to play it, the kind of things to invest in. But I think there's something else quite interesting going on in a work like this that is resolutely, dully factual. There's nothing fictional and interesting about it. And yet, if you see one of the photos at the beginning, which is showing their offices to show that they are respectable and just like a proper brokerage, you've got people sitting in rows in front of the quotation board as if it's the cinema. And I guess that what I think is going on here is that it is transforming their sense of self, that they are obsessed with following the market in a minute-by-minute basis, even when they don't actually own any stocks and shares in any real sense. And so you've got the idea that these books are transforming the individual into an anxious watcher of the market, and that they project onto that stock market graph, which first comes into being in this period in the kind of late 19th century, a sense of their personal well-being, but also national mood is projected into these graphs. The fourth thing I think I would point out is that these books help change the way we think as a society about the role of economics, whether risk should be social and collective, something that the welfare state or the corporation takes care of, or whether risk should be individualized, that you are responsible for taking care of your future through your pension or your education that you have to save for. It's that sense of risk being individualized, and that these books play into those fears, but also those fantasies, the idea of that you can be in control of your own destiny if you just read the right books. And I think what's going on is there, in effect, is a financialization of the self, or every aspect of everyday life. And therefore it's not surprising that quite a lot of these writers were also writers of self-help manuals. That whatever else these books do when they talk about finance, actually they're talking about the transformation of the self. That they're like diet books, or they're like self-help books. They're endlessly produced and endlessly consumed. And what they're doing, in addition to offering specific financial advice, is telling you how to become a better person, or how to transform yourself.
If you want to find out the history of how to become a better person through learning about the history of financial advice, then we've made available through the Library of Mistakes an annotated guide, a finder's guide to the collection, and that we hope you'll come to the collection, come to the library and use this resource. Thank you.